territory, home of the Cree, Dakota, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota, Lakota, and homeland to the Métis. We are here to discuss immigration. Are we doing it right? And this is one of my favorite subjects, and I love talking about it because it's a very personal topic to me. But first, I'd like to remind everyone to turn off their cell phones. And I'd like to acknowledge before I forget, Sharon Grind, can you wave? Where is she? Oh, she's there. She is the organizer of today's event and has tirelessly worked for 6 months, and she's keeping a weather eye on me. I have exactly 4 minutes to speak, and what I want to tell all of you is what were the immigration rates in Canada? In 2017, 300,000 immigrants were invited to Canada. And Saskatchewan itself, I want to talk about our own population growth. In the year 2006, our population started to fall below 1 million people. And that's when the government decided it had to do something radical to raise our population levels. And the government changed its immigration policy in order to attract immigrants out of their traditional cities, which are Toronto and Vancouver. And they offered incentives like fast family reunification, faster citizenship, because it was the only way for them to decide to make Saskatchewan their home. So for one decade, from 2007 to 2017, Saskatchewan grew at an astounding rate of 167,000 people. It worked. We hadn't grown that fast since the 1930s. And so then it becomes very personal for me. I am a daughter of immigrants, and my story is the story of many people who came to this country. My father, he was born in India during the partition between India and Pakistan, and when that happened, he was 15 years old. And he became part of the biggest human mass migration at that time. He instantly became a refugee because he was Muslim and lived in India. And the Muslims in India were asked to move to what was then Muslim Pakistan, and the same thing was happening to Hindus who lived in then Muslim Pakistan. And he became overnight a refugee and lost everything. The only way out of systemic poverty for him was to become educated. He quickly went to school on scholarships and became an engineer, and then emigrated to the same country that had caused the issue of colonization in India, which was England. He was a structural engineer, and he specialized in concrete. And he was working in Liverpool with the Mersey tunnels, for those of you who are familiar with Liverpool. And while he was there, Canadian immigration recruiters arrived. And they said, listen, we would like you to move from England to Canada. And they offered him incentives like family reunification, citizenship, a job, housing. And so he decided to move his family out of Europe to Canada, where he started working on the CN Tower to make sure it didn't crack because it was made out of concrete. And that's where I grew up. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I would grow up in a country that had a multicultural policy. I was very religious. We were from a very conservative Muslim family. I went regularly to the mosque. And at a certain point in my life, I decided to wear the hijab. And this is the 1980s, when hijab was unknown in Canada. Our teachers thought it was the strangest thing they had ever seen. These girls who started showing up with their heads covered. But they said, it's weird, but what can you do? And so they let us wear it. And I continued, and a strange thing happened. I just felt like I belonged, I had value, I was a part of my community. And then I decided to change my career path. As everyone knows, the dream of every immigrant father out there is medicine, and that's where I was destined to go. But I switched it to journalism and then ultimately to comedy. And I created a show called Little Mosque on the Prairie. And it became a huge international hit, and it went around the world. But what was fascinating to me was suddenly I got a lot of Europeans calling me and asking me questions about the show. They were not interested in the comedy part of the show. What they were interested in was, how is it that Muslims and non-Muslims were living in the same city, sharing the same house of worship, with the same levels of income and employment as everyone else? And I was like, I don't know, this is the way it's always been here. What's the problem? And that's when I started doing some research into the history of immigration to Europe, which has been radically different than the history of immigration to Canada. Had my father picked Germany as the country to immigrate, because they were also recruiting immigrants, but from Turkey, what was happening in Germany at the time was, after World War II, they needed to rebuild their structural infrastructure. So they were inviting immigrants from Turkey, but they decided they were going to make them temporary foreign workers, house them in ghettos outside of the city, not give them citizenship because they were not expected to stay or welcome to stay. But they ended up staying for generations. So their children were not able to get citizenship, and then their children were not able to go to university, and then ghettos started to form, and millions of Muslim migrants communities started to form for generations where they couldn't assimilate or be part of the culture of German society because all the avenues of movement up the income stream and up the education stream were closed off. And suddenly Germany had a huge problem of millions of people who were neither German nor Turkish because these children had been born in Germany, so they didn't know anything about Turkey anymore. And suddenly there was this huge immigration problem in Germany. And if my father had chosen France, France had decided that hijab would no longer be allowed in schools. So I wouldn't have been able to go to high school. I would have been removed if I insisted on wearing my headscarf. And it would have been a really, really confusing time for me because education and faith were equally important. And I would have had to make a choice, and there were some girls who were choosing faith over education and going into an underground schooling system where they became more fundamental and less religiously oriented. And so that was a way in which immigration had become a failure in European countries. And so I hadn't known it at the time, but what Canada had given my father, which was citizenship and housing and access to a country through religious accommodation, made me the person that I was, and that I was able to succeed and be able to go to university and succeed in my profession and to be able to talk to you here today. And those elements that exist in this country exist in very few places on earth. And this is why when Europeans came to examine Canada and say, you know, the levels of employment and education of your immigrant community are almost at par with the main community, they couldn't understand how Canada had done it. What were the elements that they had enacted? And that was the research that I started doing. And that's when I realized how important the immigration policy that Canada has in terms of the success and inclusion of its people. And I realized that it's not perfect and that we do need to work on it and that there are some problems. But by and large, it made me the person that I am today, and I don't think I could have been this person in any other country in the world. And on that note, I am now going to pass over the microphone to my friend, and she will be the host of tonight's discussion. For those of you who don't know, she is the host of The Morning Edition. She has been a ledge reporter for decades, and she has been working on CBC Radio for over 20 years. They call her Stephanie Langendegger, but I like to refer to as a second-generation immigrant.
Thanks, Sarka. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Thanks everyone who came here in person tonight, and also those of you who are watching online, and we're delighted to have you participate in this conversation with us tonight. We're talking about immigration, as Zarka says, not a new conversation in Canada unless you are Indigenous. Everyone's come here from somewhere else, either a long time ago or more recently. Like Zarka, that's how I got here. Both of my parents moved to Canada from other countries, and they came here to make a better life for themselves and their future children. They met here, but they knew that they wanted to do things in Canada that they didn't think they could do in the countries that they came from. And like Zarka, that's shaped who I am and how I feel about this country, I think, because my parents chose Canada and they have really strong views on this country. And so even though the numbers of immigrants to Canada are relatively small compared to the population that's here, it's still obviously super controversial when we start talking about limiting it. And what criteria should we use to decide who's most worthy to get in? Should it be people who can contribute economically? Should it be people to whom we have a duty ethically or morally in the world? All of those conversations can be polarizing, but we're hoping tonight that we will have a very interesting conversation, because if everyone agrees, then there's nothing for us to talk about here. And we know everyone doesn't agree. We know that there's probably going to be an election issue. Even the pro-pipeline convoy convoy had people there in yellow vests talking about closed borders. So there's no conversation that immigration doesn't touch on. And so that's why we're here tonight, to have an open conversation. I'll introduce you to our panelists who will help us have this conversation, but we'd like you to be a part of. There's a microphone here for those of you who are here, and in a minute I'll tell those of you who are watching online how you can take part. So I'll start to my immediate right here. Haida Amirzadeh was born in Iran. She came to Canada as a refugee in 1989, and she's been advocating for other newcomers ever since she got here. She's one of Saskatchewan's top immigration lawyers. She has her own firm, and she also teaches immigration and refugee law at the University of Saskatchewan. She's a mother of 3 and fluent in 4 languages, which you'll hear is not unusual on our panel. Thanks for being here, Haida. Next to her is Abdi Gurey. He's originally from Somalia. He's an occupational health and safety administrator and a tradesman who's worked in construction and oil and mining industry. Abdi's also spent a lot of his time giving back since he got here to other newcomers. He started a group to assist Somali Canadians, and he also started the Prairie Somali Canadian Community Centre. Abdi's a father, a husband, and a university student. Thanks for being here, Abdi.
Thank you.
Next to him is Wojtek Dolata. Dr. Dolata was born and studied medicine in Poland. He's an oncologist. He's also studied business, and he's interested in politics. Dr. Dolata is on the executive of the Regina-Louvain constituency for the People's Party of Canada, which you will probably know as Maxime Bernier's new party. And Wojtek is a husband and a father who also speaks 4 languages. Thanks for being here, Wojtek. And finally, at the end, but not least, we have Chris Katarna, who has come a long way to join us tonight. He was born and raised here in the city of Regina, but he spent his entire adult life, he says, as an economic migrant outside this country. He's Oxford educated. He has a doctorate in politics from that famous university, and he's co-author of Age of Discovery, Navigating the Storms of Our Second Renaissance, which, among other things, predicted Brexit and, who saw this, the election of Donald Trump. He did. His next book is called, I'm not blaming you for it, but saw it coming when others maybe didn't. His next book is On Point, Post-Truth Migration Politics and the Fight for Democracy's Life. He said to me this morning that immigration might be the canary in the coal mine when it comes to democracy. So we'll talk about that tonight. Chris, thanks for being here. And I'd like you to meet tonight Madeline Kotzer. She is our social media news editor. She's monitoring your comments online. She'll get your questions to the panel this evening. And Madeline, we polled people as they came in tonight, and you have some results from that as well.
We did. So thanks everyone for being here and everyone online. We've got folks watching on our YouTube channel, CBC Saskatchewan. We've got them joining the conversation on our @CBC Sask Twitter account. So if you're too shy to come up to the microphone, you can use the hashtag CBC Asks, and we will see your comments and we will put them to our panelists tonight. And we're also on Facebook. And this is a conversation we've been having all week. But of those in the room here, 49% believe yes, we are doing immigration right, and 51% said no. So what we're going to do is we're going to have this conversation. I'm going to take in comments and questions online and relay them to our panelists here. And perhaps at the end of the night, we'll check in and see if these poll results have changed.
We really encourage you to take part. Don't be too shy to come up to the microphone. We'd like this to be a conversation. But if you're online, definitely use the hashtag CBC Asks, and we'll get your comments to the panel. I'll start with the question. I've already had people challenge us on the question, which is great, so you should. Immigration, are we doing it right? What do we mean? What do we mean by right? For whom are we speaking? Those are all good questions. And I don't know what you answered when you said, are we doing it right? But we'll let our panel just jump off from this, and we'll see where the conversation takes us, whether you mean doing it right for the people who are coming, whether you think we're doing it more right for refugees than immigrants, or vice versa. We'd just like to talk about this conversation because obviously there's some disagreement no matter what you use to answer that question. So we'll start with Haida, and I'll work my way down and just have you talk in general whether you think Canada is doing immigration as well as we could be.
Sure. As you mentioned, this is such a broad concept, so I tonight
for most part, I will be wearing my lawyer hats. So I'm looking at the plan that the government had made. It's really good to see that they are forward-looking and they're making an action plan to increase the number of immigrants that we are allowing to come to Canada every year. That is very important to have a plan and increase it. We need immigrants in all capacity. We need skilled workers, highest skilled workers, lowest skilled workers. We need them to come in all different categories. They can come as temporary workers and they work their ways and become permanent residents. We need caregivers, we need entrepreneurs to start businesses, to bring money in and bring their skills and management skills. So in that way, I think we're doing a good job in looking forward and increasing the number of immigrants. Also, I think as part of the process, now immigrants that they are coming, or the future immigrants that they're mostly coming, they will be more prepared. Before, the process was that everybody was coming with very high education, young, with good English, and a lot of good work experience. But when they would arrive to Canada, they always had to change their resume and because they were overqualified and some of these jobs they couldn't work. Now the process had changed and people have to, in advance, they have the option of applying for their education to be recognized and their credentials to be recognized in advance or work towards it. So that's very important because when they come here, they don't come with a false expectation and coming and realizing, no, actually you cannot work as an electrician, as a plumber, as an engineer, as a doctor. So that's the good thing. What we can improve, I would say, is to put more resources on settlement and integration. I think that is something that no matter how well-educated person is, no matter how their English is good that they come to Canada, still they're coming to a brand new country. With a lot of differences, cultural differences, geographical differences, climate differences. So I think the settlement services are doing a great job, but I think we need to put a little bit more resources in them and have them all over, not just in the big centers. We have in some smaller towns as well, but I think we can expand on that. So these are the things that I think we need to improve a little bit, and also with the regulatory bodies that they basically the gatekeepers of allowing the newcomers to have their credentials recognized. We need to bring them on board. We need to have them to help the newcomers to process their credentials faster and help them to get recognized and move forward and start working and living here. That's what I think.
Thanks, Haida. Abdi?
First of all, thank you, Steph and CBC, for having us here tonight, and thanks for the audience for being here. I think, as you said, this is a very delicate and interesting question. Is immigration works for, are we doing it right? So, and one needs to ask the same question. So I think, what do we mean when we say that, are we doing it right? To me, yes, we are doing it right. Canada is doing immigration right. I'm a proof of that. I'm a product of immigration, and I sit here tonight. And also, when you look at it, Canada is also very lucky because there's only one border in this country. So if you look at what's happening in Europe, where there's too many borders, and then immigration becomes more complicated. So there's only one border in this country, and that goes to the United States. We don't expect too much people coming from there. I know it's happening now, but not money before. So in that way, immigration is manageable when you talk about it. It's very manageable. And the government of Canada and the system has been doing a very good job to the point where Trump, the president of the United States, of all people, who is against open borders and everything else, is looking up to us and saying that we better do what Canada is doing. That's manageable immigration. So we're doing it right. We are managing better. We're welcoming people. We are very generous in welcoming people. And it is really working. It's give and take. Canada is getting people who are highly educated. And they're coming here as most of it, over 60% of immigration to Canada is economic immigration, which means people who are skilled, people who have skills to transfer, people who have money and business to invest in this country, people who are creating jobs. So if you look at that, it is give and take. And coming back to the question, I always believed immigration works. It works for me, and it worked back. I have, ever since I came here, I have worked so hard. I've done everything that I can in my power to contribute to this country. Whether I have to work out in the field in minus 40 or 50, which is not where I come from. It never gets really. You go to Africa, especially in the Horn of Africa, it's always hot. There's a nice beach. There's Somalia. A lot of people hear about Somalia. It's about where the pirates are. There's a trouble there. But it has never been the story. When I was growing up as a young person, lived there, it was a peaceful country. Things happen. A lot of you share that story with me. I might be the first generation here, but if you look back your history, a lot of you here, if you're not indigenous, you had that same story too. Your great-grandfathers came the way I did. I was a refugee. I did not really have the chance or the option to leave my country. It wasn't an option for me. I have to leave. I have to find a safer place, which was in Kenya at the time when I moved out of Somalia. And eventually, through the Canadian resettlement refugee programs, I came here. And I ended up going to Winnipeg, of all places, which I don't regret. It was so cold at the time. Because winter, somebody told me when I was complaining about the winter, he said, you didn't choose the right place to come. You could have gone to Vancouver. I said, it wasn't on my choice. So anyway, to come back to the point, I believe the immigration system works. We are doing it right. Yes, it's not perfect. Every system has problems here and there. It is hard, really. It's not easy. A lot of people think that you come here, it's the land of the honey and the milk. It is a very good country. I'm very fortunate to be here. But for immigrants, a lot of you might not know it's not easy. You have to work harder. For those who don't speak the language, you have to not only speak, make it perfect speaking, and sometimes people expect you not even to have an accent. So it's not easy. So there's a lot expected of us. We do whatever we can as immigrants to immigrate and be part of this country. I believe the immigration works, but we can make it better. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdi. Wojtek.
This is a very complicated question, and thank you for this. I'm a first-generation immigrant. You are a second-generation immigrant, and most of us are first. You are expatriate now.
I escaped the winter. I don't know.
But you're still coming back. That's good. So
never say no to the CBC.
Yeah. So the paradigm that we try is formed is that there are immigrants and there are Canadians. Now, after 1 or 2 years in Canada, I still considered myself more like immigrant. And I would take everybody who was not fortunate to come to Canada, come with me. But I know that maybe 1 in 100 made it here. The other 99 were left behind. They were not taken in. But I know that they couldn't be taken all, because then it would be 10 times more immigration, be 3 million per year, which is not possible for Canada to do. Now, so after years, I think of myself, and I think it would be easier for us to think of us as Canadians. We are all Canadians. After 1 or 2 years, we are all Canadians. So we have to change our way of seeing things, not as immigrants, but as Canadians. So what is good for Canada as a country is more important than what we are thinking as when we are immigrating here. We have children here. We will have grandchildren. If this country is prosperous, peaceful, and stable, then we all be benefiting, including the immigrants who are coming here right now. Now, there is a lot of reservation about immigrants coming here. We have 51% saying that we are not doing things right. And the reason we are meeting today is exactly because maybe we are not doing things right. The biggest thing that we are not doing is right, that we are not very good at economic assimilation of immigrants. Now, Zarka mentioned that we almost like after some year we have the same opportunity. We have to remember that in Canada, unemployment among immigrants first generation immigrants is like between 13 to 15%. And average unemployment in Canada is 5.8%. Now, this high unemployment among first immigrants carries into the second generation. It is more than 8% in the second generation of immigrants. So if we don't, when the rest, those who will live here for long is about 4%. That means if we don't give opportunity to the first generation immigrants, it is not only for the last few years, but also for the future, maybe for next 20, 30 years even forward. So, and there are many reasons for not good assimilation, economic assimilation. Abdi mentioned the credentialing. Well, most of the credentialing, I'm professionals, and I see my friends here who are also professionals, came from all over the world. It's very hard to get credentialing in Canada. It's almost impossible. Well, why? Well, because we have like monopoly for all professions. There are monopolies who give credentialing, and these monopolies are sanctioned by government. If we have different credentialing, more diverse, the competition between credentialing organizations, we could probably solve it. If we have credentialing from, let's say, Princess Margaret, or from University McGill organization that competes with other credentialing organization, maybe you would hire engineers who get credentialing from University of Calgary rather from the government in Ottawa. So we need to kind of break this mold that prevents skilled people from entering professions here. But,
okay.
And the other things, we talk a lot about what number of immigrants. The reality is these numbers are not that increasing as was proposed. We know that Quebec right now is planning to cut immigration by 20%. And this People's Party that I belong to is planning to do pretty much the same what Quebec already announced. But this cutting the numbers is more symptom that with the current numbers, they cannot handle the current levels of immigration, cannot integrate immigrants. And this creates a lot of problems. So because the problem is happening, so let's just decrease the number. Probably not the best solution. It's find a solution to actually integrate immigrants here.
Okay, and we can. And when you talk about that, are you meaning immigrants and refugees? When you talk about integrating newcomers to Canada, are you talking about both class, people who come as immigrants and people who come as refugees?
Well, the immigrants and refugees are not that dissimilar. I would say that refugees are as skilled as other immigrants. You can always find people among refugees who can actually integrate in Canada very well. Let's remember, we kind of think of immigrants or refugees as if it was monolithic, homogeneous group. Among the refugees or immigrants, there are lawyers, there are fishermen, farmers, welders, construction workers, and university professors, and so on. So we have to start thinking about immigrants and refugees as people who have already passed, who have experience, not thinking as some abstract concept, but rather as individuals who have their specific humanity and skills and experience.
Chris, do you want to talk about how well immigration is working in Canada and maybe pick up on Wojtek's point about how well newcomers do and whether that becomes then passed on into future generations, not as well integrated into Canadian economic society as we would hope?
Okay, maybe if I could make just a couple of my own introductory comments to the question first. First, I guess just to echo Abdi's point, that thank you very much for inviting us to be a part of this panel, and thank you all of you for joining us in this conversation, and thank you all of you for voting an equal split on the question, which is fantastic. And I suppose, I was sort of reflecting on that as each of my fellow panelists were laying out an initial response to the question. And on one level, it seems very difficult, actually, to argue that we're not doing immigration right. I mean, whether it's an economic migration story like Zarka's father and how successful that was, or Abdi's story as a refugee, Clearly, we must be doing a lot of things right if it's possible to come to this country and, in contrast to immigrants to many other countries, sort of achieve similar equal outcomes to people who are born in the country. And so then the question becomes, well, then what is this division in our judgment of are we doing it right? And for someone living in Europe right now and like sort of being in the midst in London of a kind of political maelstrom, which was largely sort of traces its beginning to the 2015 refugee crisis, when roughly 1 million refugees from Iraq and Syria came into Eastern Europe and Germany and then up through Greece and Italy and started this giant re-examination. And I think what it is, I think what it is maybe, as we ask this question, are we doing immigration right, is I think maybe there's a distinction between sort of, are we getting the policy right, which seems to be a very technocratic question, and are we getting the politics right, which is, I think, a much wider question of how do we, as a society, examine and deliberate the many consequences and choices of being a more open or a more closed society. And this morning when I talked about immigration being kind of the canary in the coal mine of democracy, what I meant by that, and I think it's maybe clearer in Europe or clearer in the United States, is you can see how the immigration debate is exposing some like deep questions about how our politics works. Questions like, you know, does the sort of political party spectrum of left versus right still do the work of sort of representing the divisions of voters in society? And what you're seeing right now in the British Parliament is sort of members of Parliament leaving the Labour Party, and members of Parliament leaving the Conservative Party to essentially form new groups independent of those parties to say, you know, we as a bloc are for a more closed policy, we as a bloc are for a more open policy. And those new choices that they're presenting to the people are each attracting large followings that are very different from traditional choices of, you know, I'm more Labour or I'm more capital. And we're seeing the same thing happen in Canada with the People's Party. So, you know, we think that there's another axis of choice making that people want to be able to express. And for whatever reason, the system of our politics hasn't made that choice an axis of division. But if we do so, a lot of political entrepreneurs are finding that there is a strong constituency for that. I think another challenge to our politics of immigration that even this discussion exposes is that the discourse tends to be heavily focused on economics, where I think the evidence is overwhelming that immigration is a good thing. And I mean, I'm personally, I would say, radically pro immigration when I just look at the economic argument. I mean, we should, just as economists, we should all go back to kind of pre-World War I, where nobody had passports. And if you could get somewhere, then you had a right to be there, because it would have massive positive implications for global GDP. I mean, sort of the economic community is pretty clear on that. But I think I would guess that, you know, that the room feels very divided on the question that we're starting with, has to do with a lot of dimensions of immigration and its consequences that are non-economic. Right? What What are the cultural implications? What are the long-term demographic or social implications? You know, even just psychological implications. What's my capacity to negotiate change in my community? And you know, these I think are the more difficult things to air in public discourse, but that I suspect are nonetheless real. And either we develop a way to sort of work on this stuff in our politics, or we'll work it out sort of privately. And then I think maybe the third sort of deeper question that immigration asks about our politics is, you know, do we need to kind of look at citizenship and what we understand citizenship to be? And again, we talked about this briefly this morning, right? But one could fear that citizenship has become a dangerously thin concept in society. I mean, in this country, until very recently, you know, permanent residency is something that one could acquire through an investor class visa for a few $100,000 and buy your way into insidership, acquire all sorts of rights that come with that, but it's less clear what responsibilities you acquire. On the other hand, you know, citizenship seems to have become a thin thing when it is possible for you know, someone who has lived here for decades to be treated as an outsider simply because they weren't born here. And so I think, you know, when I look at, are we doing immigration right? And when I look at how explosive this topic can prove to be in European democracies, in the US democracy, that's where my concerns begin about maybe we are doing the politics wrong, or at least maybe there is a whole other level of brave discourse about all this other stuff that we should figure out how to do so that we can, you know, rather than have some kind of similar explosion of rhetoric in our society, that we can have a much healthier conversation about what I actually think is a much more complicated question than the policy arguments that we tend to focus on.
Okay, I have lots of follow-ups for you, but let's check in with Madeline Kotzer and see what people are saying and asking so far.
Yes, as Chris mentioned, it is a complicated issue, and in preparation for tonight, we at CBC spoke to several people who have immigrated to Canada in an effort to understand what that whole process was like. And one of them was Ponziano Aluma, who I believe is here in the audience with us this evening. But he shared very openly about his journey here from Uganda. It was very difficult. He lost his wife and a child in the process. And so he shared that struggle with us. And then he also shared very candidly about his thoughts on the anti-immigration movements we see sweeping Canada and the world. And basically, Mr. Aluma said that those movements are driven by emotion and not fact. And he said that people seem afraid that the face of Canada is changing as newcomers begin to come from all over the world and not just Europe. And really, Stephanie and everyone here should know that his comments were a flashpoint in the conversation we've been having all week. So several people wrote in, and here's one of them. Don Kostiak said, "The immigration issue appears to be more about disdain for demands to accommodate groups of immigrants who are intent on changing rules and laws for their singular benefit. True, my ancestors also came to Canada, but were happy to assimilate, not create groupings and politically push their religion or ideals from an old country. A pierogi was part of their heritage, but it was not shoved down anybody's throat." So that's a taste of the conversation.
so to speak.
So to
And I hope we can talk about that because Abdi, you talked a little bit about this, I know, in terms of what your experience was like when you first came to Canada and how that maybe has changed over the last 15 or 16 years. And what is your perception of whether there is less tolerance? You said at first people were curious about where you came from, but not hostile to what you might be bringing here. Do you want to talk a little bit about the change you've noticed since you've been in Canada?
Sure, absolutely. And that's another very interesting question. And I think, yes, when I first came here in 2003, as I mentioned already in Winnipeg, like immigration was a different issue. People could come up to me and ask, hey, I'm a little bit curious, where are you from? And I remember one time, like, when I get there, about my second or third month, I was already working. And I remember getting, like, there's a welcoming when you come to this country as a refugee. There is an obligation that the host country should help you get settled. So it's about a year program that you help people settle down. It's way different when a lot of people here, your great-great-grandparents came here. It was much even better because people were given land and a lot of other things. Here it's just only 1 year, and you have all 1 year to settle your life and get whatever settled down here. And a lot of people don't speak the language, don't know the culture, don't know how to find the jobs. It's a little bit complicated. And I came here, I didn't even have any other person before me here. I was the only person from my family at the time who came here. And I remember then I get a job because me coming here, my perspective of going to Canada was this great nation, advanced, developed nation. I have to be part of that society. I have to work hard and be part of that. So integration at an individual level as an immigrant, it's ingrained in. Like, all of you can maybe support me on that or be different, but the first generation immigrants always have the will to succeed for the generations to come. If you don't succeed, your children will not succeed. So we're all enjoying here as immigrants or somehow having backgrounds of immigrants that what our forefathers and the first generations did is develop this country and make this country a better place. So it's ingrained in me and all first immigrant generations to work hard and to do better. So when I got a job in my second or third month, and I remember sending the support checks back to the government and saying, I don't need it anymore. So this idea of that immigrants come here to suck the economy and get, be strained on the economy, it's not really, it's a myth. I send the money back to the government because I have to work right away. So I remember people coming up to me, coming to your question, asking me, hey, where are you from? There was a young gentleman that I was working with, and I remember I was on the phone on the lunchtime talking to other people from my community that I basically, by the way, I speak 3 languages.
No, sorry.
So I was on the phone, and then he came up to me when we were on the line. He said, hey, what was that you were speaking in the lunchroom? I said, that was a different language. And he said, how many languages do you speak? I said, I speak about 3 fluently, but I can speak even more than that sometimes. And he was like, how do you do that? When people come up to you and ask you a question, do you think about which language to use to answer? Like, you're going to use just Somali or Swahili or Arabic or English? That's even 4 languages I speak. So which language do you use to speak? And I said, it's just right there. I don't even know. People ask me, you come to me, you speak Somali, I'll speak to you. You speak Arabic, I'll say the same thing back to you. You say in Swahili, it's just right there. So that was the conversations I used to have back then. People were curious about what I speak and where I came from. And I remember a lady that I was working with telling me that when I said I was where Somali, I said in Africa, she said, oh, the only thing I remember from Africa was the elephants and the animals. My grandma used to tell me about these beautiful animals there, so I never thought there are people in Africa. That's what she said seriously. So that was the conversation I used to have. Not anymore. These days, it's way different. And I understand that. It's a hot topic.
How is it now, Abdi?
Now it's more political. People will come up to me and will look at you and give you some, the look that you should go back to your country, where you hear things like that. So it's way different. It's way different. I'm a Canadian citizen. I have been here quite some time. My children, all of them, were born here. As the lady here said, we're still getting the question, where are you from, my kids? I am from Canada. I was born here in Regina. No. Well, where? Where are you from? It's really tough. It's tough. So sometimes it is, as I agree with you, Chris, it's the politics of immigration. It's not the people. People have the same idea, whether it's our great-great-grandfathers who came here for money of view. The intention was to be a place where they can have a better life, build a life for their families. Still that exists in all of us. We're coming here not to be enemy of this country, to build this better country, to contribute. And to be honest with you, the issue a lot of times is about assimilation. Let's be honest. Assimilation. In this era, we should be talking about assimilation after what happened to the indigenous people, and we try to assimilate people. We should be even talking about it. We should be ashamed of it. It works when people are different, and we appreciate our differences and our multiculturalism, and all we have to do is love each other for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please feel free to go to the microphone if you'd like to participate in the conversation here. We're happy to have you take part. Maybe just say who you are and then...
So I'm Jessica, and I'd first like to thank you for sharing that experience. And I'm sorry that that is the experience you're having now. That's really unfortunate. But I would actually like to respond to the comment that Madeline Kotzer read to us. The woman who said that her grandparents, her great-grandparents, whoever it was who immigrated here, didn't force their culture on Canada. I would say that Indigenous people would probably disagree with her. So absolutely they did.
Thanks for that, Jessica.
Thank you, CBC. Thank you. It's a great panel here. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Ted Geleda. I came from Ethiopia 36 years ago. So since I've been here, for the last 36 years, a lot of things have changed in Saskatchewan. And at the time when I was arrived, 3 or 4 weeks just wandering around, I don't see someone looks like me. At the time, immigration was unknown. A few times I was stopped and asked for autograph. They thought I was a Rough Rider. When I say, oh, you are so skinny, you are right. And when I opened my mouth, of course, my accent, and the people shy away. And I made my home, and I became productive contributor, member of society here. I did okay for myself. I have 2 boys, wives, and when I say things have changed, and Abdi actually touched a little bit earlier, the changes, especially the last not quite 10 years. Earlier, Zarka indicated a number of newcomers have immigrated and changed, face of Saskatchewan have changed. And also the current social media have changed how we think. There's a misinformation. Refugees getting, the people, if you keep on asking me, you must be receiving a lot of help from the government. I'm a professional. I work for federal government, doing very well. No, thank you. Actually, never had received any form of social assistance from the government the last 4 years. So my question to you guys, the way of the political talks going on by some of the populists, actually some of the elected officials are using the negative sentiments about immigration trade. That's actually changing the way of we think about immigration. Always they talk, immigrants do wrong, bad thing, not the good thing, what we contribute. And since I have been in Saskatchewan, there's at the time people came from Poland, came from Vietnam. There's one of my friend, he could not speak a word of English when he arrived here. I have 150 people working for him. I look, Regina, walk around the restaurants. All kind of ethnic group, I don't know, my friend earlier said that unemployment among newcomers, I don't know where I like to see that actually starts. I don't think so. We take every conceivable job. Look, 7-Eleven, Walmart, unwanted jobs, cleaning street, buildings. We are a contributor. Our contribution is immense. So I guess one of the things also we like to add another one is some of the smallest country has been destabilized by war. Our government actually have contributed for that. Look, Libya. What happened for Libya? When Gaddafi was removed, that was wide open now. Everyone actually can cross the Mediterranean Sea. So those people, actually, we allow them, we destabilize their livelihood. When they run away here, no, we don't want you. And actually, we need to tell our politicians, please don't destabilize those countries so that flex of immigration, actually, our government have been contributing that. So, and anyway, just go to back. I don't want to keep talking. I can talk forever, comes immigration. But the current social media have missed this information, negative sentiments about immigration, how to tackle that. What's your opinion for four of you? So I'd like to hear that if you include your discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, Wojciech, do you want to talk? Because part of that is to you, right? About
the
newcomers, not doing so well economically.
And also what you mentioned, that these traditional political party, left and right, don't address the immigration issue or integration the right way. You have a left-wing political party say, we'll do everything for immigrants, we'll ask for credentialing, but they will not say why. And I'm here for 30 years, and the story is all the same over 30 years, nothing changed. And then you have the other group will say, okay, the Canadians who live here, their jobs potentially is undermined, their wages are stagnant, maybe the immigration is not that good for the country, for your individual life. So that's why you have parties who kind of trying to figure it out what is in the middle, potentially have better solutions, like for whole Canadians. There is no difference between you and me, and it's not even about race or anything, basically about the opportunities that we have here. Now,
how do you limit then, as the People's Party of Canada, how do you limit immigration? How do you decide where to take fewer people from?
Where to take fewer people from? Well, okay, so there are a few things. We will not solve things, the attitudes, by whether we take less or more.
But you would like to take fewer. That's the campaign
Quebec
of the...
also is doing the same thing. They announced already that they are cutting by 20%.
Right. So when you do that, where do you decide to take...
The argument in Quebec is that if they have fewer numbers of immigrants, they can take better care of the people who are already here, to divert resources towards integration of the immigrants who are already here.
Right, but others are saying the immigrants who come here are doing just fine, thanks very much.
Well, if you have unemployment by 13 to 15% in first generation and 8% more in the second generation, it doesn't sound like fine. If you have people who advanced skills, good education from other countries, and they cannot enter their professions, their human potential is not being utilized. Obviously, they are not doing fine. Now, Chris mentioned that the GDP of a country grows when you have more immigrants. Well, if the immigrants don't work, they cannot be professionals the way they used to. Obviously, they produce less GDP themselves. Granted, you can take... Canada has 37 million people. If you add 37 million immigrants, the GDP will not increase by 100%, will probably increase by 50% because the immigrants are not being utilized. Their potential is not being utilized. Now, what it does, people who already live here, their wages are stagnant, they can go lower. The GDP of a country may go higher, and this is good for a big business. That's why they advocate more immigration and more, because you have more banking, more real estate, more buying and commerce, and this increased GDP. But individual worker, individual person in Canada sees their wages stagnant, has to compete for their jobs. We have to remember where this sentiment questioning immigration comes from. Well,
where does it come from? You think it's from people who are not getting the jobs they think they're entitled to?
No. The first thing, if we accuse of Canadians who built this country for the last 200 or 300 years, that they are bad or maybe even racist or something. This doesn't help. They invited us here. They took us here. You see, there are other countries like Japan. They almost take no immigration. They function perfectly fine, and they have good standard of living. Now, we are fortunate that being invited by Canadians who have this, as you said, they have managed. We are all immigrants in a way, but we also, Canadians also, right? So now, when you take the population in Canada, you have 5.8% unemployment right now. This is 1 million people in Canada who are presently unemployed. We have labor participation only like 60%. So 1/3 of people don't even, many of them don't look for a job. We have poverty, 4.9 million people below poverty line. Almost 1 in 7 people in Canada below poverty line, they are poor. We have a healthcare that is underfunded in a way. There are waiting lists, not enough drugs to be covered.
But I'm not sure if the relationship between those issues and immigration has been proven here.
Well, what I'm saying, telling the Canadians who live here for generations that they are bad and they are somehow
I don't think anyone's saying they're bad. We're just asking in what way.
Maybe they have some bad. They were 20 years ago. They were good. Now they are. They have worse attitudes. So.
Well, that's people's experience of how they've been treated here, right? I just want to go to Haida for a moment.
Which is a consequence of the policies of the party who antagonize the immigrants versus people who live longer here. So we have to recognize two sides of the coins: those who invited us, and also those who come. What I'm saying that when immigrants here, we want the immigrants to be that they can contribute fully to our country, that they will not increase GDP by 50% when we come. It will be 100%. That would be good. So we cannot. So I'm more than for immigrants to be successful here.
Okay, Haida.
I think one thing is very important to distinguish here between refugee and immigrant. We cannot use those terms interchangeably, even though eventually they become permanent residents or they arrive to Canada as a permanent residents, but they don't go through the selections. So they're not coming here with the good language skills or with education, or some of them do, but the criteria is not set for that. We are accepting refugees based on their risk that they have in where they are, and we are providing a safe place for them to come and live here. So I think maybe when you're a statistic talking about unemployment, sure, that is very acceptable to somebody that comes here, doesn't have any English, had been in a refugee camp for many years. You don't expect them to come here and the next day get up and go to work. So the statistic, I don't think is correct, that's what you're presenting it. And also, it's important to know that there is a huge competition between Canada, Australia, United States, even though on the surface we only pay attention to anti-immigration sense that this is existing, but they all spend millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to attract good immigrants or the high qualified immigrants. So we cannot have a population growth without immigration at all. We cannot have any economic growth without immigration. So this is something that if you're going to dismiss that, then we're kind of starting from somewhere very wrong. So just the issue here is not that, what you're presenting. The issue here is like the immigration. Are we doing it right? Or at least that's the point of the question here.
It's why I asked earlier about refugee versus immigrant, because the recipient rate of social assistance for refugees and immigrants, not all refugees who are like, take your money, I got it, I'm in 3 months here, I got a job. But some are, even still it falls precipitously over years. The social assistance, I think 5% of social assistance in Canada goes to refugees. The other 95% goes to Canadians. But
technically speaking, immigrants that they come here, they have to show that there is a proof of fund for 1 year of settlements, but based on the number of families that they have. So we don't expect them to right away, and that is how it is set up to go to work. They are spending their own money so they can settle, they can get a job, and they can write proper resumes that's acceptable to the Canadian employers and get some training, and they get their soft skills kind of improved. So then that would become, then they become part of the society. Usually under the 1 year, but there's expected for them not to work right away.
Yeah, we have lots of people at the microphone, so let's get a few more comments and just.
Sure. My name's David Herbison. I'd like to start off by saying I'm pro-immigration. I'm currently in the process of sponsoring my wife. It's been a very complicated and long process, and we'll be very happy for it to finish and for us to be able to start a life together. On that note, my question is for Chris. I found it very interesting that you mentioned that you thought that having open borders would be good for the world GDP. You're obviously an intelligent man. You've done your homework, and you would have your reasons for that. I'd be interested to hear what your reasons are. Furthermore, you mentioned that it would be good for the world GDP. I wonder what you think about if Canada were to have totally open borders, would that be good for Canada's GDP? So kind of a two-part question. I'll let you answer that. And the second part of the question, if it's at all possible for Haida, because I've been through the spousal sponsorship process. It's changed considerably over the course of the last 2 to 4 years as the transitions from a conservative to a liberal government, and they're heading in the right direction. Now, I've been fortunate enough to backpack travel around the world and talk to people, couples all around the world that have met overseas. And the one thing that I found very confusing and very interesting as a Canadian person who's extraordinarily lucky to have a Canadian passport, which we don't really realize or appreciate until we have one, or until you invite your lover and partner to come share this opportunity in the country and have all kinds of hang-ups and issues and delays and such. I do think that government is heading in the right direction in this regard. But the question is, do you see that Canada has timeframes which are acceptable in terms of comparing them across other countries, modernized countries, and not in terms of uniting spouse and family? So that's my 2 questions for you and 1 question for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll just give a brief response so that we can get through a lot of questions. First of all, I like to take radical points of view. I think that it helps to clarify some things. And if one just takes a pure sort of economic look at the immigration question, which, in my initial remarks, I talked about the politics. I don't think that that's the healthy way to answer such a complicated and fragile part of our discourse. But if one's just an economist and look at it, the economists in the room would argue, well, this just has to do with friction or flexibility with the inputs to production. Right? So the whole argument for globalization over the last 25 years is you liberalize the flows of capital and trade so that sort of you can allocate resources to where supply and demand meets out. It's just supply and demand. The strongest empirical argument for the economic gains from free movement of people right now is probably the EU. And if you just look at the data and the research of the last 25 years or so of how the liberalization of movement of people has led to increased economic growth rates in the countries that have been strong recipients of essentially low-cost labor from Eastern Europe. So the UK, for example, major recipient, and there was an economic boost to that. But if you want to go offline, we can sort of talk papers and stuff, and there's quite a lot of research there. Was there a second question for me?
If it would benefit Canada, I think, to have our border completely open. Right.
So I guess maybe let me give the more apocalyptic argument there, which is that there is a sort of 2 big trends. One is demographics. Right? And there's pretty clear evidence, and there are cautionary tales all over the developed world, the advanced liberal democracies, of the economic costs of population decline. So aging societies, like Italy right now is going through this. Japan is going through this. China is going through this because of its one-child policy. Just the way that our whole economy is set up for growth, it is really nasty when you say, we've got too much capital stock, we've got to start tearing down houses, right? We've got too much public infrastructure. It scares investment away. It scares youth away because it's like there's no future here. So it's really nasty when you start to go into population decline. And we too are an aging society, and as it's been said. So And policymakers here in 2006 said, well, the only solution then is we need immigration to top that up. The other argument there is climate change. So because whatever happens sort of from a policy perspective for the next 10 years, the world is going to have significant climate adaptation to do. And one of the ways that's going to hit everyone, maybe most visibly, is going to be climate refugees. Low-lying and heavily populated parts of the world where people are forcibly going to be displaced because disappearing coastlines. Bangladesh is the example that's often used. We're talking about tens of millions of people who are going to have to move. And it's very likely that sort of post-2050, world is going to look at that problem and say the current refugee system is just completely not at the scale required to deal with that. Countries like Canada that are relatively less exposed to this issue and have a lot of land per person, you've got to step up and take a dramatically different share of the burden of relocating climate refugees. Right, so there's a lot on the horizon that says that it's going to be really important for Canada to have a capacity to take in a lot of migration. I'll just briefly say, and I'd love to talk about this a bit later, but I'm very curious about in 2006, when the government apparently made this policy decision that we need to take in a lot of immigration. Was there a wide-ranging and robust and interesting public discourse within Saskatchewan about that policy choice? And I'm here, so I wasn't here, so I'm asking the audience, because I would imagine, it kind of gets to the social media question, is when there isn't, when these decisions are taken and sort of said, like, there is only one truth, we have to do this, that is when I think it creates a public discourse environment where people are looking for the opportunity to express a whole range of issues and concerns that weren't expressed when they felt they should have been. So that's an aside that maybe we pick up later, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah, if I can tell you a little bit. I mean, just in a nutshell, Brad Wall, when he was Premier and the Saskatchewan Party government, talked very much about economic immigrants coming to boost our labor force, and getting 60,000 more people into the labor force was the #1 goal on Brad Wall's 2020 growth plan. It was when Syrians were coming under the federal Liberal proposal that Premier Brad Wall wrote a letter really warning about screening and making sure that we weren't taking on more than we could. So I would say there's a pretty clear delineation here between economic immigrants coming under Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program, which was expanded to allow for a rapid reunification of families, and then, Hayden would know more about this, but then it was curtailed because there was some talk about fraud where people would come from BC, sponsor 15 family members, get them here, and get back to Abbotsford. So there was no one really staying in Saskatchewan, so then SINP kind of curtailed itself again. I'm sure that's a really rudimentary and overly simplistic view of what they did, but it was definitely talked about as an economic engine, and some of the controversy was, could we have done more with Indigenous people who already lived here to get them for fully participating in the workforce as well, and whether that would have made the province healthier economically. But there was a question for you about spousal reunification.
I think spousal sponsorship procedure, relatively compared to other countries, I think Canada has a decent process and time frame. At times they put it in the back burner, and then people put pressure. Right now the minister had promised 12 months. Even to me, that 12 months is too long. Which one of those MPs would separate from their spouses for 12 months? They wouldn't even for 2 months, never mind for 12 months.
How long have you been at this? Longer than that?
Yeah, my case is, there's a couple things that I could have done that I did not, and a problem with an immigration lawyer and such. So I've been waiting for 4.5 years.
Wow.
But I will say that that is largely due to miscommunication errors between being an immigration lawyer and then my wife going home and having to refile out of the country. But the issue is I've talked to people all over the world, and everybody sees Canada as a very liberal place with open border policies. And one would think in a reasonable, civilized country that you'd be able to, especially as a Canadian citizen, you'd be able to be with
Bring your
wife
spouse here,
sooner
yeah.
rather than later. And everybody I've talked to all over the world, including the States, people from Turkey, people all over the world. My wife's been to Australia, where I worked in Australia. She's been denied 4 visitor visas in Canada. She's been to Canada 5 times as a flight attendant and left. She's not allowed to come, hasn't been allowed to come visit for 5 years.
Okay. Thank you for that. And sorry, it's complicated. Thank you for that. Please come up.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Marie, and I have a strange question, maybe like a change of scale. As we know, when it comes to immigration, people are very concerned about the change of face of Canada, right? However, we are a bilingual country, and we know for Francophone to survive in this country, we need to increase the number of Francophone immigrants. And yet, federal targets are not met. A very low number of Francophone immigrants make it to Canada. There is no provincial strategy in Saskatchewan to support Francophone immigration. So I wonder, how come that the question is never discussed when we talk about immigration?
Well, you just raised it, so there we go. Does anyone want to talk about?
I think I can just maybe comment on that, because Quebec has their own completely separate and independent immigration process. So then the rest of Canada feels that kind of they take the burden and they take care of it. I think that could be part of it. But definitely recently there has been a lot of action and a lot of support and a lot of points given to if somebody is coming from French-speaking countries. So I think that is changing a little bit, but I think that's a valid point for sure.
The 4% target is met, and we know that even with a 4% target, 20 years down the road, there's no Francophone speaker in Canada. So as a bilingual country, do we want to remain a bilingual country? I think it's a question worth discussing when we talk about face of change. Right?
Absolutely, I agree with you 100%.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew. To this question, are we doing immigration right? I was wondering if the panel, and this isn't directed at anyone in particular, could comment on inequalities created through the various streams of immigration. So we've talked about refugees versus immigrants, but I think it's important to drill down a bit further. I would argue that our existing immigration system as a whole generates purposely different forms of access to permanent residency and citizenship. It generates inequality. So people who come over as an oncologist have easier access to permanent residency and citizenship than someone that comes over here to serve coffee at the Tim Hortons. So to that point, where does migrant worker programs fit into this question of if we're doing it right? And just to be specific here, if we think about the Quebec example that's been summoned, as they're looking to decrease the number of immigrants, the province is also trying to boost the number of temporary foreign workers. So they're not good enough to stay, but they're good enough to work is a real problem. And it suggests that temporary workers are then filling what is a permanent need. So there's a political issue there. But if we look at, say, the temporary foreign worker program, there's a handful of streams there. Caregivers, farm workers have very different access to permanent residency, and they're also subject to closed work permits, more forms of exploitation and abuse. International mobility programs privilege some countries over others. So if you break it down, are we doing it right if we include these different migrant streams? And how does that change the question of what do we need to do to make it work and make it better if we think of the inequality amongst migrants and immigrants in Canada?
Yeah, go ahead, Boyd.
Well, you mentioned oncologists is better future in Canada than somebody who serves coffee. So, you know, as an introduction, yes, I was an oncologist before I came to Canada, but let me tell you one thing. There is zero chance to be oncologist in Canada if you come to this country. The most that you can hope, maybe you'll be in a small town as a family doctor. But if you immigrate to Canada and you a landed immigrant here, you have close to zero chance entering Canadian system. That's why I was doing business. You know, I could do this, and maybe I'll be more successful in business. But you know, I returned to the profession not because through Canadian system, to the U.S. we have more opportunities. Now, you mentioned the temporary workers program. we're talking about 300,000 immigration in Canada right now, 310, 50,000, 60,000 refugees. But the temporary workers program is 300,000 people coming to Canada. And these 300,000 people are no different from immigrants who came in the other program. And the immigrants who came here to settle in Canada, who decided to live in Canada, who chose Canada or Canada chose them, they have to compete with these temporary workers who may stay here for shorter or longer. Now, if you are temporary workers, temporary worker in Canada, you are tied to an employee. Well, at best, you are tied to a province. I think average Canadian would be offended if you tell that, well, you came to Prince Edward Island. You have to live here. You cannot move to another province. Or you move to Quebec. You cannot move to Ontario. That would be freedom of movement would be affected. Ordinary Canadians would be disgusted if you tell that you have to work for one employer. If you quit the employer, you would be deported or you have to leave the country. If you are a nanny here in Canada, you are dependent on the people who give you the job to take care of some elderly person or child and so on. Some of these living conditions, like being like a slave almost in their home, you are scared to protest. If you are a temporary worker in Canada, you don't have the protection of unions to fight for your salary.
So should we not have temporary foreign workers?
I think this undermines not only the immigrants who come here, the other 300,000, but also undermines Canadians who are looking for a job. Remember, we have 1 million Canadians.
A lot of Canadians won't do those jobs, right?
No, because if
agricultural work and so on, there are a lot of Canadians who don't.
We have a farming country. For 300 years ago, we have farming and
for sure. I grew up on a farm. My dad could not find a farm laborer. Not a Canadian. People didn't want to do that work.
So if somebody doesn't want to do the lower amount of money, if there is no competition, if it's not cheap labor taken from outside, labor that cannot negotiate, cannot unionize, cannot fight for their rights, the salaries would increase.
Yep, that's a good point. And that's what was said about Tim Hortons, that we were using temporary foreign workers to subsidize massive companies in Canada.
You can go to Banff, most of these
Let me ask the other panelists, do you think that temporary foreign workers is a class of worker that's just ripe to be exploited and we should get rid of it?
Definitely, no, they shouldn't get rid of it, for sure. I think different provinces are dealing with temporary foreign workers differently. Saskatchewan definitely has started as a pilot project, but it still is continuing, and so people that they are in service industry, they are eventually able to apply for permanent residencies. But there are, when you're talking inequality, definitely the seasonal workers are the ones that there's no path for immigration for them, but a lot of them, they do come with that knowledge, and they need that money, and they do come for 8 months, and they go back for 4 months, and they come again. So I think that is an issue that's been debated for a long time, as long as I think the employers are being scrutinized and make sure that they're not abusing the employees. I think that there could be a balance. If you tell all those Mexicans that we have an agreement with few countries that the seasonal workers, they come, that we close that door, you're not coming anymore, I don't think they're going to be happy and say, okay, good, because we were being abused. So I think integrity of the program is important to maintain. But I would like to make a comment on equality and access to permanent residency, especially with oncologists or doctors. I think one thing that Canada definitely is discriminating big time is in relation to physicians. There are certain countries, including South Africa, are exempt. So they would be bringing South African doctors, and they will facilitate. Actually, they go recruit them, then they will facilitate that while they're writing their exam, they can be working, and eventually they do become. And also, it's still it's not complete. It is quite difficult for a physician to get their certification, and that again goes back to the regulatory bodies that they like to close the door as much as possible. So that has to be addressed for sure. But at the same time, there are people. We do have friends that they are. now citizen, and they came here as a landed immigrant, and they are physician, they're specialists. So it's not like really black and white, but there is a lot of inequality issues in relation to accessing to permanent residency and citizenship.
Thank you very much. I see a lot of people at the microphone, so I'm just going to encourage you to come on up and.
Hi, my name's Manmeet. I came to Canada as a student, worked my way up through a job, became permanent resident, recently became a Canadian. I see myself as an example of someone that's brought talent to Canada, as well as I've learned Canada as a country, and I was recognized for it, and I'm fortunate enough to live here. But my question is to media. Media today is the face of how people think. Why is media after getting the first bite? Why isn't it about asking the right questions? Why is the question, are we doing the immigration right? Why isn't the question, are we making people understand the immigration right? Are we making current Canadians or new Canadians understand what Canada stands for? Is media doing that right? Is media asking the political leaders the right questions? Why is it about swinging from left to right and right to left between liberal thinking or conservative thinking? Why can't we find a more balanced approach? That'll be my question. Why is there discrimination based on what you think, what you eat, what you look like? And why isn't there more inclusiveness about what you think and how you fit in?
Thanks. I'd like to think we're contributing to that conversation tonight. Thanks for that.
Can I make a comment about the students as well? I think one of the categories that now the new government again brought the student category back and giving them some points. It's important to see, like students, international students, they should be completely welcome and like really embraced, because they come, they spend their own money with high tuition, and they go through the other education system and make their way, and then at the end they struggle a lot in order to become permanent residents. So I think that is one part that definitely government has to look into it, and the employers have to be more open to employ them in the field that they finish, because they really put their own effort and put their own money to like much higher, because this international student pay depending to different provinces. The different provinces have different rates, but it can be as high as 3 times more than permanent residents or citizens would be paying. So I really have a very soft spot for students, because I see at the end they do spend all the money, and at the end sometimes they have to go back home, which is a loss to us.
Hi, my name's Maria. I wonder, when we talk about immigration, if we realize that it's not a separate issue unto itself, and that all these issues we're facing are interconnected. And are we ignoring the effects that globalization has in causing a lot of these problems, whether destroying the environment and causing destabilization and wars? And I also get kind of upset with this commodification of life that we see. We always talk about GDP and that, instead of these are real people who have just been forced to flee their country because of horrific things. I think it's really horrible to be judging them based on what they're contributing and to our GDP, and instead of seeing them as humans. And it just feels like, why aren't we talking about this more? Like, why do we accept that we are commodities? It feels like we are really slaves, and we're just fighting amongst ourselves to say, what better rights can we have as slaves, instead of saying, why are we accepting being slaves?
Thank you. Sure, go ahead, Wojtek.
Sorry, I missed your name.
Maria.
Maria, sorry. If I could just, this phrase, commodification of life, I think has a, because in so much of the discourse on immigration, it is a very kind of flat discourse. You know, especially again sitting in Europe, where this is sort of coming at us every day in the media. You know, migrants are sort of one of 3 things. They're terrorists, they are, or they're victims, or they're economic units. And of course, all three of these narratives are dehumanizing. Right? They essentialize down to one piece, and it may not even be a valid piece. So just as an observation, I've really enjoyed that a part of what this evening has been so far is kind of expanding on our stories. Zarka's story, Abdi's story. I mean, I think that in itself is a very important change that we need to make at just a kind of an individual level, at a societal discourse level, is to actively thicken our identities in these conversations. And it gets to sort of my opening comment about I think there's a dangerous thinning of citizenship taking place, and commodification and marketization is part of that.
Wojtek, you want to say something, and then I'll go to Madeline Kotzer and see what people are saying online.
The globalization is an interest in big business, essentially. It is not an interest in ordinary workers or citizens. And actually, the citizenship and sovereignty are obstacles to globalization, because we have thought that we think too narrowly. We don't allow people to come en masse. We don't have open borders. The question was actually, what would happen if we open our borders? We know that there was a program for family reunification. The application ran out within 11 minutes from opening. We can make an experiment and see what happens if we open our borders. Let's abolish immigration. Let's open the border for 1 month and see what happens, whether our GDP, whether the wealth of the nation, whether cultural stability, political stability will remain. There are 65 million refugees in the world. If we open borders, I'm sure that at least 5 million would readily come here. And so we know that we cannot solve these things, but saying that we are for open borders, well, it's easy to say. We are surrounded by oceans, and we have very tight border with the US, and we have very strong bureaucratic barriers for immigration, and we put quotas. We are not opening borders. Even the most liberal people in Canada, they're not talking about opening the borders. They briefly talk about increasing immigration to 450,000. Well, they already scaled back to 310.
Okay, let's go to Madeline.
Okay, so a lot of the conversation tonight, both in this room and online, is about the economics of immigration. So I've chosen a handful of comments that sort of represent different perspectives. First comes from Salman Ahmad, who writes, "Why do highly educated immigrants as skilled workers have difficulty getting a job? Why is the Canadian experience a compulsory requirement for most jobs? Other countries like Australia have better processes and programs in place to integrate immigrants." Brenda Sharing writes, "We need to elevate immigrants to sustainable employment. Language training is crucial. Hostility towards immigrant workers is based on language learning." And Brendan Plews writes, "Canada shouldn't fund integration programs. If you want to live in Canada, it's your job to fit in."
Okay, thank you, Madeline. That was a blunt last word there to someone. Let's just keep the conversation. Abdi, did you have something you wanted to throw in?
Quickly, if you don't mind.
Yes, no problem.
I just want to go back a little bit to some of the statistics we shared tonight here. I don't know, we all tend to have different statistics anyway. This issue of, first of all, let me touch the issue of open border. I don't think the issue of open border is even a question to ask. There's no country in the world that advocates for open border. Not Canada, not anywhere else in the world. Even where I come from, they don't like open borders, to be honest with you. Nobody likes open border. As an immigrant and a citizen of this country right now, I would never advocate for open border. It's my safety of my family, and all of us. It's not open border. It's the people who want to use the term open border to create misunderstanding and misconception about immigration and the system, the Canadian immigration system. As our friend here just explained, it's not easy to come here. Read my lips. I have been through the system. It's not easy. One border, I said, it's true. But not only that, our technocrats and the bureaucrats make sure that the system is not easy for even the most highly skilled people to come here and contribute to this country. Even the refugees, yes, they are different category, as the lawyer here said. I have, since I moved to this country, and even before I came here, I worked with the United Nations Office for Refugees, UNHCR, as some of you may know, in Kenya, in Nairobi. If you look at how the process works, even with the United Nations, I used to sit thousands of interviews of refugees and potential immigrants to other countries, going through the refugee system. Apart from listening to the horrific and the trauma that people go through being a refugee and leaving their country and the civil wars and the destruction, even UNHCR has to make their due diligence to make sure that that person is a refugee. They use a program called a refugee determination status to determine whether even your claim is believable, whether you are a genuine refugee before even you come to this country. And it's through the UNHCR system that gives a code to different countries. They submit to different countries like Canada who are accepting refugees. Do you want to accept such a refugee from such country? Then it's the government of Canada and other countries to accept that, whether they want to accept that refugee to come here. But by the way, what's the difference between a refugee and immigrant? What is it? Look at me. I was a refugee. I became an immigrant, a permanent resident. I contribute to this country. I'm a citizen right now. We all have the skills. The language I speak today, I was never going to school in this country to speak this language. Think about it. Maybe we can sometimes demonize refugees like they are strain on the economy. It's not the way it is. Through my connections and work with the community, I meet people every day who are looking for a job, who are working 3 or 4 shifts to make ends meet. Tell me a conventional Canadian who works 3 jobs or 4 jobs. Very minimum. I could be pessimistic, but very minimum. Because some of you have the leisure of going back to your families, other people, the farm, the economics, the relatives. Refugees don't enjoy that. And when you come here, you have to fit in for sure. But how? You have to buy a car, a house. How do you do? Government will write checks for you to buy a car. No, that's a myth. People want to work, and they work 3, 4 jobs. And those are the refugees, most of them, because economic immigrants have skills to find a job right away. It's actually the refugees who are also highly skilled, doctors, engineers, anybody who are driving the taxis we all of us drive, who are cleaning our buildings, hospitals, everywhere, cooking the food in different places. The issue of temporary workers, yes, sometimes I do believe that undercuts the idea of integrating people, because when you have other people who are here before who are struggling to find a job, of course, sometimes I'm not against the temporary foreign worker. It's not the policy of the immigration, though. It's the economics. It's the capitalist way we live in this day and age. The Tim Hortons, the McDonald's don't want to hire me as a permanent resident. They want to get more even cheaper. Cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So it's raised to the bottom. It's not the fault of the immigrant or the temporary worker or the refugee. It's the system, the economics, the people with the money. It's the capital system that we enjoy here. It's all of that. So I think the issue of open border policy doesn't exist. It's a myth. The issue of immigrants and refugees being strained on the economy, it's also a myth. We're all here contributing, working hard, and trying to get the day by. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdi. Please come to the mic.
Thank you. My name is Manal, and I'm glad I'm going to talk about, because my point exactly related to what he said, Abdin. And I came here like 15, 17 years ago as a refugee. And 1 month later, I never lived in a camp, and I never got into a social assistant. A couple of weeks later, upon my arrival, I got like a volunteering job. 1 month later, during my volunteering job as the receptionist or front desk person, I did, the story is long, but the result, I did a training for a group of 15 students, between students from University of Regina and some of the social worker, I believe. Like all of them, about 12 ladies. I did a training I used to do back home. When I came here, I came with my credentials. I have my master's in environmental studies. So why am I mentioning that? Because the issue between or the definition of immigrant and refugee, is it the way you came to a country or it's a label? Because most of the time we talked about the refugee people as labeled. Being a refugee, that you should be like this amount of education, and you have to do this kind of job, and you have to, no matter what. Even I was doing 2 jobs at a time, as you said. When it's a cashier at one of the stores, and the other one it's a coordinating program, literacy program for one of the community organization. And people, they couldn't relate to myself. They saw me, or they met me at the store where I'm doing the cashiering. And on the other side, they came and talked with me, like intellectually, if you can say that, trying to find the problem to some of our clients. There is one lady, like, we have been working together for three years. The end of the 3rd year, she recognized this is the same person. Yes. Why am I saying that? Because as I said, it's always feel like freaking about this segregation between refugee and immigrant. What is it? I think for me, it's just a way, because I had to flee my country at a certain specific time because there is threats and everything. And there is no other way for me but to come as a refugee. Some people, they have to leave their country to another country, neighboring country, which is wherever, as you said, Abdin, Egypt, or wherever in Africa. And then they apply to come as a refugee through the settlement program. Some of us, or some of the immigrants, they find a way and they come directly to Canada, USA, wherever the country. So for me, it's just the way you came to the country. But what is the conception about that? It's became like a label. A label for your refugee, you have to do, as I said, blah, 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 blah. So we need first to make it right, to connect, or to, I don't know, to redefine, or to do something to make sure there is no difference, as I've been said, between a refugee or immigrant, but the way they used to come. Second thing is employment. I'm not going to tell my story about the employment because it's long, but employment, it's another issue. We should really, really be careful about that. And through the immigration, I'm just talking about, I have a friend of mine, a neighbor actually, and he came through this nominee program, whom they did all the credentials outside. And unless they passed that, they will never be able to come to Canada. And yet, he has been here for a year, and he's an engineer, civil, I think, and he couldn't find a job. And he was asking that question. This is not my question. This is his question. Like, he believed that when they did all these credentials, which I haven't done because the way I came, or maybe I'm doing, or maybe there is some of us here, but we did that inside Canada. But he had, for him, he had done that outside. And he thought, and he said, he think he's going to find a job right away because he did that. He did all the interviews. So, and yet he couldn't find a job. So the issue of the employment and credential is very important. The issue of refugee and immigrant is another very important thing. And I would like to conclude with the Canadian standard. What do we mean by Canadian standards? And I was hoping that there is somebody representing the, and forgive me if I didn't say it correctly, I mean political correctly. It's a First Nation or Aboriginal or whatever, the First Nation of this country, to be, one of them to be sitting here. And we have this discussion because we can relate to each other, because when you mentioned, Chris, something about the new, the way they, if I understood you, the way they treated the newcomers or the immigrant because they are not born here, But there are people whom they born here, but yet they are still having the same kind of treatment. So I have to conclude with this, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we'll just bring you up, and then we'll try and talk at the end here, just as we're, come on up.
It's too tall.
There you go.
Good evening. I'm Jeffrey. I'm currently taking up Master in Public Administration in Johnson Shayama Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Regina. So before going to my question, I just want to reiterate my understanding about the primary question, which is immigration, are we doing it right? So for me, that covers all the national issues relating to the mandate of immigration. Correct me if I'm...
Sure,
okay.
Whatever you want it to mean.
So my question is there any government policy at the moment that will going to help out the immigration and CBSA, or the Canadian Border Services Agency, in dealing those thousands long-standing unresolved cases of marriage and relationship fraud? And my second question, if there is none, what's the government plan?
If I understand your question, you're asking what is CBSA doing about relationship fraud and marriage fraud?
And the immigration, if there's a government policy that will help out immigration and CBSA for those long-standing and unresolved cases of marriage and relationship fraud.
Is that a big problem in Canada, marriage and relationship fraud?
It is a big problem right now because there's thousands. I know we have an immigration lawyer here.
Yeah, I'll ask Haida.
It's not as big as actually they represented, definitely, and I think that's why there was, based on the perception that it was presented, the previous government tried to follow the United States model, and they put a conditional permanent residency on spousal sponsorship, so which the Liberal government changed that. I think it is by a statistic, it really is not that big, but because it's so huge in our mind that it is such a big problem, like we make it much bigger than it is. So it wasn't worth the time and the effort that we put, and they tried that they would put like a couple for 2 years of waiting to become permanent residents. It wasn't worth it, so that's why they removed that. And unfortunately, there are marriage frauds, but as soon as somebody becomes permanent residents, unless there are really, really substantial evidence that the person was intending and did all the frauds, it's really difficult to take their permanent residency from them. So it's this is one of the issues that they just have to deal with it, scrutinize more, and unfortunately that becomes the reason that they linger the processing of the application, because they want to ask so many questions and documentation to make sure that the marriage is genuine.
Thanks, Haida.
Good evening, my name is Daphne. When I saw the post in Facebook about this session and immigration, are we doing it right? I have yes and no as an answer. I think we're doing permanent residency, whether it's economic or family class, we're on the right track. We're doing it right. I can say yes on that part. But when it comes to temporary foreign workers, I think we're not doing it right. Because I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant, and in my practice, I get a lot of people who come to me and ask if they can just come to Canada and work. They're not intending to stay here permanently. So a lot of us here we have the perception that most people would like to stay in Canada permanently, right? But I came from the Philippines, and a lot of the people from the Philippines would say that they would want to retire in the Philippines. You know, why retire here in the cold, right? So I think we can learn from countries like the Middle East or Japan and just Canada is a good country. And we can make those programs better for temporary foreign workers. But I guess we shouldn't worry too much about making making the temporary foreign workers permanent residents right away, because there are people, those people who want to stay here are willing to take the English exams and are willing to, to get their credentials assessed if they really want to stay here permanently. A lot of the frustrations from temporary foreign workers is that because they had the notion that they can stay here permanently, and then when they come here, there's no program for them available. Whereas if right from the get-go, they know that they're just coming here temporarily, then there's no frustration if they can't stay permanently, or they're already set up to think that they can, there is a program that they can become permanent residents, but they have to, be able to qualify under those programs. So I think, and also temporary foreign workers right now are contributing to CPP and EI, and when they don't have statuses here anymore, they really can't avail of EI, and they can't avail of the pension that they have been paying for.
Thanks, Daphne. Hello.
Hello. My name is Wayne. I'm a second-generation Canadian, and I'd like to talk to your comment about the free land of the people who came here before you. I would say that the sweat equity in those homesteads, there was no such thing as free land. You earned every square inch that you were able to claw out of the prairie. Only 1 in 3 of these homesteads were successful.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Roman, and I'm originally from Bangladesh, as you mentioned about the country. And it's been about 25 years I've been living in Canada. First, my elder brother moved to Canada when back in maybe 76 or something. And when there was no visa required to come to Canada, so he came by that time and he sponsored us. We came as a family, my parents and 4 brothers. And I started my school back in Toronto about grade 8, and then complete my school and college, and then I moved to Regina about 10 years back. So I thought maybe it's a good opportunity, thank you, and having this kind of events, and it took me very interested to come and share my history, and also I was just listening to other people's comments and statement, and I found a lot of things to learn and also share my experience about the immigration program. So one thing I'd like to mention about being in Regina, that I used to live in Toronto. We never thought about moving in Regina. Even I took a history class at grade 8, and we just learned about the Perrier and the farming land and all those things, and we are like, I mean, who's gonna move in there? To be honest, it's just like myself. But yes, definitely the nominee program took us really interested to come forward and take this opportunity to bring some family members. So when we talk about the immigration, we never had a lot of opportunity back in that time in Toronto, Ontario. So it's not that it's happened right away in one night. I mean, I lived in Toronto for 15 years. I never had an opportunity to bring any sponsor any family members or bring any relatives or anything. So then after 15 years, there is an opportunity like the nominee program that we can bring anyone, family members. And so I came and I sponsored a few family members, but it wasn't really easy or open for everyone. There are certain things I have to submit, and one things that maybe I don't know if a lot of people are aware of, that everyone coming to Canada, they need to have a police clearance from back home. So it's not that it's just that anyone can come. It's just the specific people who are eligible, and the qualification and the background and the IELTS score. I mean, everyone should know that they have to have a legit score that 5 for speaking and all those things. So Since then, I've been seeing stuff here. So back in Toronto, I got into sports. I started playing cricket. So it's a sports not really famous in Canada, but it was very interesting. And then I was selected to play for Canada under a 19 national cricket team, and it was very pleasure to represent the country. And then I had a great chance that I toured to West Indies with the Canadian team, youth team, national youth team. We had a tour for 1 month there, and again, like in our team, we haven't really seen a local Canadian representing the country, just like seeing all these immigrant people and mix other countries' people. And I had some other experience too that I toured to some other countries with for cricket, such in Australia. I had a chance to live in Australia for 5 months. I had a brother there, so I went there to play cricket back in 2000. And I was just following the system about comparing the Canada and then Australia, and back in 2000 to see thinking about living in Australia, or because of the cricket there is a better facilities and stuff. But I have noticed this is a very similar country, and it's just the weather is different, but the immigration system was the same, and everything seems to be very similar. So my brother told me, you are a Canadian citizen, it's better you stay in Canada and just complete your education or stay there. So I moved back. And for the question that we are asking about if we are doing the right things for the immigration, and since I moved to Regina, and one thing I understood that why the nominee program was brought to here. Like this is one of the biggest question. Like if there was a needed the needed of the immigrant people, the program wouldn't be existed. So the government thought that the immigration become very essential, that there will be a lot of people needed for the Saskatchewan or Regina. So that's why the program was bought for SINP. But again, like you have mentioned, there is a family program and the shutdown for some specific reason that I was aware of that too. And still there is a program, the skills category is very similar, and they made it a little bit of difficult that they need a job offer from a Canadian company and all those things. So again, it's not that the program is there, but they want to have this qualification people. It's just like, if you go apply for a job, there will be 10 people, and they go through and then take an interview and then see the credential and everything. So, and I think the system is great, and they just thought there is a lot of people needed. And I then later on I had a chance to work in Service Canada. It's a federal government job as an intern, and I've been talking with my colleague and everything about the immigration program, and they found that because a lot of people were moving in and they needed to provide the services, that's why the job is there, because they used to have very less people when in Service Canada. When I was talking to other people about that, and by that time there were so many people got into job because there were more people that the service was demand, like to serve all this new immigration people and everyone. So I have noticed that the immigration people has contribute a lot of economically and also the other important part in local. So for I don't know if anyone knows about the international student. I was just doing a little bit of research, and then I've noticed that the international student spending directly, indirectly contributed $2.3 billion in Canada, like the tax revenue. So it's a great thing. Definitely, it's an immigration program. There is a good benefits from the government and for everyone's. And right now, I'm working as an educational consultant with the UFR, University of Regina, recruiting international students. And I see the difference like since last 10 years. And now on, there are so many international students coming. So, and as you know, like I've been being a local, and we usually pay like about $5,000 Canadian dollar in your tuition fee, whereas the international student pays $20,000.
Yes.
So that's a big income.
It's a big commitment, as Haida was saying. Then it'd be good to get a job at the end of it. Thank you.
Yeah, and for my experience,
I think we're going to just, if you don't, have you kind of come to the end of your point? I'm just going to hope to wrap up here with the panel as we're a bit past over the time.
From my experience, I could definitely say, I mean, it's a positive things that it doesn't matter that the government is a conservative or liberal. It's a good thing that immigration program that that has been brought to Canada, and definitely it's something is really for benefit for the country as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madeline, do you have any last thoughts you would like to add from social media?
What this gentleman just said actually ties into a lot of the conversation we've had over the last week and just generally on social media. It divides often along political lines. And I'm going to give Stephen A. Smith the last word tonight. He writes, "We foolishly allow ourselves to be divided by something as trivial as liberal versus conservative, left versus right, when in reality, it doesn't affect your life much at all. I have to admit I'm guilty of this as well, and often. We lose sight sometimes of just how great we have it in Canada, of how many people suffering in this world are willing to sacrifice everything just for a chance to be part of what we take for granted." And I just want to remind everyone, don't forget to vote again before you leave. We're going to see if the results are any different. But we did do a Twitter poll, and we asked, are we doing immigration right? And 60% said no, and 40% said yes. So have your say again before you leave. Thank you.
Thanks very much to everybody who came out tonight and took part here and online, and thanks a million to the panel. I know that lots of people will be coming up to you probably and talking here. We've gone half an hour over as well, but I think it was a good conversation. Thank you for your candor. Thanks everyone here. Thanks very much to everyone here at CBC and all the volunteers who helped us put this on tonight. We really appreciate it. Sharon Grine was our producer. Thank you.